Fine sirs, good ladies, welcome to the first edition of the Fantasy Network in 2020. Today we're going to be reviewing a book that is not only an oldie, but a very goodie, A Game of Thrones by George R.R. Martin, the first book in A Song of Ice and Fire, my favorite fantasy series of all time, and this happens to be one of my favorite books of all time. I've been wanting to do a video review for this book for some time, so without any further ado, let's get started. As the first entry of A Song of Ice and Fire, Game of Thrones is tasked with introducing us to this vast world George R.R. Martin has created. The land of Westeros, and beyond that, the realm, right? All these characters that we're going to be so intertwined with throughout the next few years. But it does such an amazing job of getting us going on this journey. A Game of Thrones puts us amid plots, counterplots, tragedy and betrayal, victory, terror, and the fate of families such as the Starks, the Lannisters, and even the long-lost Targaryens. The feeling at the beginning of this book is unease. We get introduced to a lot of characters, but throughout this book we see that even within, the first 900 pages of this series, that nothing is as it seems to be. My thoughts after starting A Game of Thrones, reading through the first chapter is, let's go! The first chapter might be my favorite first chapter of any book I've ever read. And this is a non-spoiler review. I don't want to give away anything for some of you who haven't seen it, but seriously, what are you doing? If you haven't seen the show at least, the very first chapter is perfectly adapted in the show to my estimation. And they captured exactly what George was trying to get across in that scene, that eeriness and that creepiness. The first chapter, if you don't want to read after the first chapter, put it down, go read something else, because it is gripping to me, and I think from, I would say, 99% of other readers. Another thing that stuck out to me as I read through A Game of Thrones was this book does such a great job of introducing our characters, but not only giving us the characters, but giving us reasons to want to read their next POV chapter. Also showing us flaws within those characters. Someone might seem brave and bold, but maybe they're arrogant, maybe they're a little self-centered. And I think George in this entry novel did such a great job of introducing these characters in a light where you would want to see where they're going to be in 6 months to a year. And as if the characters weren't enough, the world building in this book, top of the line. Absolutely top of the line. You could feel yourself being in the Winterfell crypts. You could imagine the dirtiness of King's Landing. You could feel the culture of these cities based on the dialogue that are going on between characters. It's one of my favorite things that George does, is that he gives us so much background and history and details that we wouldn't have unless if these two characters were having the conversation at that exact place at that exact time. It's wonderful to me. As I read the last words of the book, immediately my thoughts were, what a ridiculously good ending to this book. I couldn't imagine reading this back when this released. I believe it was 1996. I couldn't imagine reading this book when it released and then having to wait for book 2, kind of like we're waiting for When's a Winter. But seriously, the ending of this book I thought tied all of these ends together, but still gave us so much more to look forward to and so many questions still unanswered. I couldn't help but just to pick up Clash of Kings and then just start rifling through those pages. I thought the ending was so strong as well as the beginning, and that's what made for such a great story and such a great entry novel to the series. One of the big positives from this series, in my opinion, is the fact that it's probably the easiest read of all the 5 books that George has released for A Song of Ice and Fire main series. I think it gives us an introduction to the characters that's very digestible, but also gives us a little bit of foreshadowing to look into the future. And obviously people have dove back into this book time and time again and have pulled out pieces of context that may have explained something that happened later in the series, which is why these books are so amazing. But just as a novel, I think it's a very easy read. It's a good introduction to how George likes to write, and I think you'll know after this first book if this series is right for you. So one of the other aspects of this book that might be considered a negative is that the pace is a little slower. If you are someone who's coming from the show or from the hype, right, the preconceived hype of this show being blood, guts, and gore, nudity, very raw, grim, dark type fantasy, I feel like this first book, while it does have some of those elements, might not tickle your fancy. It might not satisfy that appetite for big battle scenes or gruesome fights. There is action in the book, but I feel like the pacing of this novel is so much slower, but it ends at a very, very high point with a lot of things happening, and I think the payoff is well worth the trip to get there. Some people, however, might count it as a negative and not like the pacing. One thing this book does do very well, so many POVs in George R.R. Martin books, right? Song of Ice and Fire, tons and tons of POVs. Not as many as some other books like Malazan, but Game of Thrones does have quite a few point of views. However, it never feels overbearing. We get those subtle introductions to the characters, but also whenever George gives you these POVs in this book, you can tell aspirations. John wants to be a man of honor. Bran wants to be a king. Sansa wants to be queen. Don't think those are spoilers, by the way. Those are just little things about these characters that we learn. We learn their aspirations, and then we get to think, like, are these realistic for these characters? Are we going to see their souls get crushed, or are we going to see them accomplish everything they want? And because we know their aspirations, we start kind of rooting for these characters, even if they're not black and white, even if they are a little gray. The one takeaway from this book that I would say that is slightly negative for me is I'm not a huge fan of child characters, and there happens to be quite a few in the book. John is very young. That's another thing that is different from the show. If you're coming from the show and you're reading the book for the first time, the characters are actually a lot younger in the books. I think Bran might be even 3 to 4 years younger. I'd have to look at the exact age they gave him in the show, but in the books, he is quite young. For me personally, I've never been a huge fan of child characters, especially whenever they're a mainstay in the series. Don't hate me, just don't love kid characters in books or movies. However, that's only one small negative, because I come to be very fond of these kids as they grow up through the series. And in this book, the introductions are perfectly fine, and I still was interested in what was happening, even in a, 5-6-year-old Bran at the time. So one of my favorite things to do whenever I review a book is I like to go back and I like to think about, like, what was my favorite POV or what was my favorite character from the book? And in this book, I think it's pretty easy. And I feel like a lot of people will feel this way. I got to give it to my boy Ned. I thought Ned's POVs were very digestible, and I thought it was very cool how he was the one character that seemed to be very evident that he was good. He was easy to get behind. And I especially like that in later chapters, whenever he's having certain dialogue with certain characters, we get a little bit of a backstory on what has happened whenever the Targaryens were overthrown, and when the throne changed hands, what was happening at that time. Those conversations from the Ned POVs really build this history in your mind and think, oh, is that how that was? It begins the foreshadowing and also the unraveling of some of the mysteries that we see in this series as it plays out. Favorite non-POV, non-first-person character in the book has to go to my boy Bobby B. King Robert Baratheon is a flawed man, but damn it, he's funny. Some of the best quotes ever. And he was perfectly portrayed in the television show. So I had a pretty good image going into the book of what he would look like. Just a likable guy. I think whenever he's on your side, you're happy. And when he's not, he's probably a huge asshole. Aside from just a favorite POV and a favorite chapter, in my reviews, I really like to pull out maybe a favorite quote from a book. Most of the books I read do have quotes, especially George R.R. Martin. He gives us so many good quotes that you can sit there and you can chew on and you can think about, maybe even apply to your life. Some might just be absurdly offensive, like everything Bobby Baratheon says in this book. But the one that I want to read today is one from a Jon POV chapter when he's talking to Tyrion, and they're kind of insulting each other, bastard, dwarf, imp. But there's also a sense of maybe a friendship building there. It's the very, very, very beginnings of it, so you might not be able to see that, but I'll just read it to you here. Let me give you some counsel, bastard, Lannister said. It's Tyrion speaking, of course. Never forget what you are, for surely the world will not. Make it your strength, then it can never be your weakness. Armor yourself in it, and it will never be used to hurt you. It's kind of like that old cliche where your parents would tell you, don't let the bully know that it's bothering you, because if he does, he's going to keep doing it. But if you don't react, then you're going to be fine, and he's going to leave you alone. Which, by the way, never really worked. Still, cool to see that an old cliche from, obviously, the real world being put into this book in a way that can relate to two characters that come from such different aspects of life. I just think it's a really powerful thing in the series that you can look back on and you can think in the later books or even what we've seen in the TV show that Jon somewhat took that to heart whenever he talked to Tyrion that night. I like to give every book I review a score out of 5. 5 acorns. Jimmy Nuts, acorns. Come on, give it to me. So out of 5 acorns, I'm going to give a Game of Thrones a 4.5 out of 5. I think someone reading this as a one-off and they never read anything else in the series, I think this book from the first page to the last page has so much good quality content, and I think there's enough of a story told here that anyone could pick it up and appreciate what George is trying to tell in this story. This is the book that started it all for me. It started me reading again. It started me getting so delved deep into this universe of the realm, Westeros, across the Narrow Sea, the Wall, the White Walkers, all of this stuff. And I think anyone that takes the time to read this book would agree with me that it's quality So yes, a 4.5 acorns out of 5 for A Game of Thrones by George R.R. Martin. And I'd like to give a rereadability score, which is I'm not sure if it's even a word, but we're going to use it now. I like to either say low, medium, or high. I think this book has a high chance of being reread by someone that picks it up, because if you go deeper into the story, you're going to want to come back and look at some of the foreshadowing. So I think it's a high reread probability and just a solid book overall. But now my favorite part is I want to know what you think. So get in the comments, hit like if you enjoyed this video, please hit subscribe. I'm going to be continuing to make these videos. I'm going to be reviewing not only A Song of Ice and Fire, but all other types of fantasy books. The Ninth House is on my list. I'm reading through Wheel of Time right now, and I am chomping at the bit to make those videos and review. Again, thank you so much for tuning in to the Fantasy Network. I am Jimmy Nuts, and until next time, keep reading, my friends.